If anybody thinks in South Africa that you can take the land without compensation, you're living in a dream.
Hey folks, welcome back. This is Chris in Central Pennsylvania with an update on South Africa's Expropriation Without Compensation law. It's no longer an act or a bill, it's now a law. Political actors are scrambling to make up excuses and proclaim that it's not as bad as it seems. They're quick to lay out mealy-mouth excuses for why the Expropriation Without Compensation law is not really a bad thing. It's under control. They make the argument that it's all comes down to the implementation, kind of the same gobbledygook nonsense we're getting from the Democratic Alliance about the Basic Education Law Amendment Act, which is taking control of schools and handed it to the likes of Panyazi Lesufi. They said the government must negotiate with landowners first. Also, they claim that only unproductive land is affected. Now, the outright lying or cognitive dissonance of these politicians is astounding. Who bothers to mention that the law is wholly unnecessary, folks? South Africa already has effective mechanisms about land redress, if only the ANC actually used them and funded them properly. The amount of money given for land acquisition 2 years ago was just $35 million, barely enough to buy a high-quality wine estate in the Western Cape, let alone land for those who want to become aspiring farmers. Also, this is never mentioned. The ANC settled nearly all land claims over 20 years ago. From 1995 to 1999, a window was opened up in which anyone who had been cheated out of their land as a consequence of the colonial government and then the apartheid era could file a claim, even if it wasn't land taken from them, but rather from their parents or grandparents, their ancestors. They could file the land. That resulted in about 75,000 land claims, of which almost 74,000 were resolved over 20 years ago. Most of those people choosing to take money. None of them wanted to be farmers. Very few of these claims are actually about getting farmland. So it's a disingenuous argument to begin with. And it all gets lost because the media, the civil rights groups in South Africa, and the political parties all get wrapped around the axle about farming and farmland, when that's just a piece of the puzzle. The argument about land is entirely bogus. This is about stealing your property, not just land, your property. That's pretty clear. Even the Constitution, which allows for expropriation with compensation, akin to what we have in America called eminent domain, taking land for the public good. That's how we acquired land to build the railroads in the straight fashion across the plain states instead of going around like this in an unproductive fashion. They simply took eminent domain and took people's farmland and compensated them for it. And that's what exists in South Africa's Constitution from 1996, written, adjudicated, voted on, promulgated, and enacted by a majority black government led by the ANC. Now, Dean McPherson, the Public Works Minister, vows to use the new Expropriation Act laws to protect property rights. Now, I find that hilarious. He's a member of the Democratic Alliance. He told News 24 that the regulations would ensure that no abuse of the act would be accepted and that property rights would always be protected, which is one of the cornerstones of the Constitution. McPherson said, "This is non-negotiable for me as the minister." Well, how can you tell us that you are never going to abuse property rights when your intention is to expropriate property without compensation? The mere act of doing that is an abuse. It's also a human rights violation. South Africa is a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a violation of the principles and requirements to be eligible for the African Growth and Opportunity Act. That's out the window. And it's a clear violation of Section 25 of South Africa's Constitution. Now, the Expropriation Act also empowers the Minister of Public Works to execute the expropriation for public purposes or in the public interest. Yeah, well, these are big words from McPherson, from a neutered junior partner of the ANC government, one disguised as a government of national unity. It's time to wake up, South Africa. The government of the national unity is just an excuse for parties previously in opposition to glom onto the taxpayers' teat and enjoy the gravy train. I mean, what else is it? So far, the government of the national unity has brought you the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act, which steals control of schools from local school boards and forces students to learn English, a language spoken by just 6% of South Africa's population as a first language, and a colonial language, rather than being taught in Tswana or Xhosa or Zulu or Venda or Sotho or Afrikaans. So, Bella. It's also recently brought us the 3% black tax proposal, in which corporations must take 3% of their profit and give it to the government to put into a slush fund of 100 billion rand, $5.4 billion, which will be doled out in grants and loans to black businesses. So basically, you're telling businesses they have to give 3% of their profit to fund their competition to drive them out of business. How stupid is that? And now we have expropriation without compensation, a wholly unnecessary piece of legislation. So what's next? National health insurance? Certainly. What about sterilizing minorities so they can't reproduce? That sounds outlandish, doesn't it? But so did stealing lawfully obtained land just a few years ago. Now, both the ANC and Ramaphosa have been adamant that in terms of this law, expropriating authority may not expropriate property arbitrarily or for a purpose other than a public purpose or in the public interest. Well, that's just a silly asinine statement. That's already in the Constitution. Why do you need to create a law that says that? And the fact that they have to be adamant in pointing this out, telling the public to defend their signing of the law, means it would appear to be a tacit admission that politicians would use it illegitimately against political opponents or for personal gain. Why else would they be adamant or even mention this? It's already in the Constitution. Also, the law allows authorities at every level, national, provincial, and local, to steal your property. Do you really think that Gauteng's Panyaza Lusufi will not come knocking to take possession of your restaurants, your farms, Solidarity Soltech Technical School, factories? Of course they will, the first chance they get. Now, the presidency said, according to the act, expropriation may not be exercised unless the expropriating authority has, without success, attempted to reach an agreement with the owner or holder of a right in property for the acquisition thereof in reasonable terms. Oh, sure. I can see that negotiation process now. Here's 100,000 rand for your 2 million rand property. No, thank you. Okay, expropriation without compensation. We tried to negotiate. They were just hard-headed. Seriously? An expropriating authority is therefore obliged to enter into negotiations with the owner of a property required for such purposes. What total rubbish. What are negotiations when the state has the ultimate power at its disposal, as well as legitimate use of force available to it? Who will enter into these negotiations in good faith? The government? Pisha. Why would the government enter in good faith when they can simply threaten to take your property away, and then you'll take whatever you're offered? What a bunch of nonsense. Talk about abuse. I mean, are you really going to trust a government that leaves the historic Parliament building sitting behind me undefended, closed circuit television cameras not watched for days on end, and someone wandering around the building for days on end, torching the place because guards were asleep or weren't present on duty? You trust that government? Talk about a house on fire. See the picture behind me, South Africa's parliamentary building. Now, the presidency also said an expropriating authority must also attempt to reach an agreement on the acquisition of the property before resorting to expropriation, except in circumstances where the right to use property temporarily is taken on an urgent basis in terms of a provision in the legislation. And what is urgent? It's been 31 years. It would seem that there are virtually no cases of an urgent basis after 31 years. There could be exceptions, a road's diverted, a bridge has to be built, yada, yada, yada. But there's virtually no cases of an urgent basis. That's just another excuse to steal your property. The Democratic Alliance, the Inkatha Freedom Party, and the Freedom Front Plus all opposed the bill when it was passed in Parliament. All are now members of the Government of National Unity. So what will they do? At the moment, it seems unlikely that any will leave the Government of National Unity, either claiming that they will take it to court to challenge the constitutionality of the law. The Democratic Alliance and now the Freedom Front Plus have also said they'll do that, or that they can better protect property owners by sitting on the inside rather than the outside of the Government of National Unity. Now, court challenge is the only real option here, as it is clearly unconstitutional, this law. Ensuring that it's implemented fairly, that's really silly. So how are you going to do that? No matter how you dress it up, you're talking about unelected officials choosing who to steal from, not pay for land that people legally own title to. The Freedom Front Plus's Wouter Wessels says we now have no other option than to go to the Constitutional Court ourselves. And we've already started that process. We will go to the Constitutional Court to test the constitutionality because we do believe that it is unconstitutional. Well, and you're right. Now, for their part, the African National Congress is giddy about this. Their spokesman, Malengi Bengu Motsiri, had the following to say: it guarantees that expropriation is conducted fairly, justly, and with due process, ensuring alignment with Section 25 of the Constitution, which permits expropriation for a public purpose or in the public interest, subject to just and equitable compensation. But it's expropriation without compensation. So how does it ensure just and equitable compensation? It doesn't. This is nonsense. You're high as a kite. The ANC also views this law as a progressive and transformative tool to advance land reforms in ways that enable inclusive economic growth and social cohesion. By unlocking access to land, the legislation will promote the development of sustainable human settlements, enhance agricultural productivity for emerging farmers, and enable urban land development to address spatial inequality. That's all horse manure. It's horse pucky. That's nonsense. You are not ensuring inclusive economic growth or social cohesion, and you're not unlocking any land. Only 13% of South Africa's land is arable, and it's being used quite productively at the moment. Anything to monkey with that is simply going to reduce productivity, particularly with subsistence farming. How will it promote the development of sustainable human settlements? How? How? Are you building new communities from this land? It's certainly not going to enhance agricultural productivity. That's nonsense. If you want to address spatial inequality, quit having so many babies and flooding into settlements. What a load of hogwash this is. The mechanism for redress of land has existed in South Africa for over 3 decades. There is no shortage of willing sellers of land, only a disinterested ANC unwilling to allocate funds or devote genuine effort to the issue, choosing instead to stoke the fires of racial hatred and revenge. But as I've reportedly pointed out for years, this is not about land. Expropriation without compensation is about property, as is Section 25 of the Constitution. The ANC has the tools at its disposal, but they just want to steal from you. As in their racial hatred worldview, the landowners stole the land from someone, presumably Nguni speakers who colonized South Africa primarily. Only there was no such concept of land tenure for the Nguni speakers. The land was held in the chief's hands in most cases. And in any case, the vast majority of landowners in South Africa bought their land. They didn't go on commando and steal it. The bottom line is that no one alive today lost land through colonization by either Europeans or by the Bantu, because none of us are 175 years old. The ANC was charged with resolving land claims arising from the Union South Africa era and largely did so through monetary compensation over 2 decades ago. This argument is a racist argument that white folks are not permitted to own land and black folks should be handed the land to be stolen from whites. Now, shame on the United Nations, the European Union, and the world for ignoring the enshrinement of laws that violate basic human rights in a country using the rule of law to oppress minorities. That's the bottom line here, folks. There's so much more to unpack here, and we'll continue to cover the story as the days unfold. But the bottom line is here, there is no need for the law. There's simply a need for the public to hold the ANC accountable for its failures in land reform, because it has no right to steal your stocks, your bonds, your pension funds, your cars, your jewelry, your homes, your flats. And make no mistake, that's your property. It can be expropriated now by Panyazi Lesufi, by the mayor of Knysna, and by Parliament. What say you, South Africa? Bumpy road ahead. Say goodbye to AGOA and probably PEPFAR. Start buying your own antiretroviral, South Africa. See how that goes for you. Cheers, folks.